The love had been a fever in her youth, bright and consuming, and like all fevers, it had eventually broken. It left behind not bitterness, but a quiet, hollowed-out space where devotion used to be. Brenna had loved the Alpha King, Stellan, with the fierce, unthinking loyalty of a girl who believed in fated mates and storybook endings. He, in turn, had looked past her, his gaze fixed on a horizon that required a more suitable queen, a bride with a wolf spirit as strong as his own. Brenna had no wolf. She was a flaw in the pack's lineage, a quiet shame her family had borne until Stellan's public rejection had made it a public one. So she had been sent away, not exiled in chains, but given a cottage on the farthest edge of Skane's territory, where the salt-scoured cliffs met the unforgiving sea. It was a polite banishment. Here, her wolflessness could not taint the proud heart of the capital. Here, she learned the language of the tides, the scent of storms, and the deep, abiding peace of being utterly overlooked. She had stopped thinking of Stellan at all, tucking his memory away like a dress she had outgrown. The fever was gone. She was simply Brenna. And that was when he finally needed her. It began with a shivering bundle of fur on her doorstep. A wolf pup, no more than a few months old, its silver coat matted with filth and sweat. It should have been with its mother in the pack's dens, but it was here, alone, its breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. Its eyes, when they opened, were clouded with pain. The pack wolves, proud and strong, would have left a sick pup to the wisdom of nature. Survival of the fittest was the first law. But Brenna was not a wolf. She knelt, her knees sinking into the damp moss that grew between the flagstones. The pup did not snarl or flinch away. Instead, it made a weak, keening sound and tried to drag itself closer. A strange quiet settled in her blood, a feeling she had grown used to over the years. It was the absence of the thrumming, restless energy that every other shifter carried. It was what made her an outcast, but it was also what made the animals trust her. The wild hares ate from her hand, the seabirds nested in her eaves. This pup, dying and abandoned, recognized it too. It smelled her lack of a wolf not as a deficiency, but as a stillness, a safe harbor. She gathered the small body into her arms, expecting a snap of teeth, but there was none. It was just a trembling weight, hot with fever. Inside, she laid it on a clean sheepskin by the hearth. For 3 days, she coaxed water mixed with honey and crushed willow bark between its lips. She cleaned its fur with a damp cloth, murmuring the soft, meaningless sounds one makes to a frightened child. The fever did not break, but it did not climb. The pup's life clung to a fragile thread, but it held. She named him Moss, for the soft, resilient green that thrived in the shadows of her forgotten cottage. On the 4th morning, a shadow fell across her doorway. Brenna looked up from the pup, her hand instinctively tightening on its fur. A man stood there, broad and tall, his silhouette filling the frame. He wore the black and silver of the King's Guard. His face was weathered, his expression grim. Halvor, captain of the guard. She remembered him from the capital, a man as silent and solid as the fortress walls. His gaze dropped from her face to the pup nestled in her lap. His stony expression flickered with something she couldn't read. Surprise? Disgust? "We have been losing them for weeks," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The pups. A sickness takes them. The healers can do nothing. They die within days." He took a step into the cottage, his presence shrinking the small space. He looked at Moss, then back at her. "That one was from the Whisperwind litter. We thought it had been taken by a fox 3 nights ago." Brenna said nothing, her body a shield between the soldier and the pup. She had done nothing wrong, yet the old instinct to hide, to make herself small, rose in her throat. Halvor's eyes, the color of a winter sea, met hers. There was no accusation in them, only a weary sort of wonder. "It should be dead," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a fact that she, somehow, had defied. He had not come here for a stray pup. He had come here for a reason that was beginning to dawn on her with a cold, dreadful certainty. She had built a life here out of the ashes of her old one, a quiet, solitary peace. The sight of the king's colors on her doorstep felt like a violation of that peace, a ghost from a life she had survived and buried. "The king has sent for you," Halvor said, his words falling like stones into the quiet room. "He commands your presence at Stonefall." The journey back to the capital was a long, silent torment. Brenna rode in an enclosed wagon, the pup Moss wrapped in blankets at her feet, a silent, warm weight against the chill of her own dread. Halvor rode alongside, his posture unyielding, his silence a wall she had no desire to breach. Through the small, barred window, she watched the familiar landscape of her exile, the gnarled pines, the gray sea, give way to the rolling hills and dense forests of the heartlands. Each mile closer to Stonefall felt like a step backward in time, stripping away the woman she had become and leaving the raw, humiliated girl she had been. She remembered the great hall, the scent of beeswax and roasting meat, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She had stood before Stellan's throne, her betrothal silks feeling like a costume for a part she had failed to learn. He had not been cruel. His voice had been low, dispassionate, as he explained the needs of the pack. The need for a queen whose wolf could run beside his, a lineage of strength to hold their borders. He had looked at her, but his eyes were like polished stone, revealing nothing. He had announced his betrothal to Lady Albrede, whose bloodline was as pure as her wolf was powerful, and Brenna, the wolfless anomaly, had simply ceased to matter. The pity in the crowd's eyes had been worse than any anger. The wagon rumbled through the main gates of Stonefall, and the sounds of the city assaulted her. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of merchants, the low thrum of pack life that vibrated just beneath the surface of it all. It was a frequency she could feel but not join, a song sung in a key she did not possess. The fortress loomed above, a jagged crown of dark stone against a bruised sky. It had not changed. It was still a place of power and secrets. They did not take her to the great hall. Halvor led her through a series of quieter courtyards and stone corridors, the air growing colder, smelling of damp earth and medicinal herbs. He stopped before a heavy oak door. "The healer will see you first." Inside, the room was dominated by drying racks hung with herbs. An old woman with a face like a weathered map and eyes as sharp as flint looked up from a grinding bowl. Maeva, the pack's foremost healer. She had been old even when Brenna was a child. Her gaze swept over Brenna, missing nothing, and lingered on the bundle in her arms. "So this is the miracle," Maeva said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "The wolfless girl who can stop death." There was no kindness in it, only deep, weary skepticism. "I did nothing," Brenna said, her voice quiet but firm. "I gave him warmth and water." "We gave them warmth and water. We gave them every remedy known to the pack. They still died." Maeva set down her pestle. "The king believes you are the answer. He is a desperate man, and desperate men are often fools." Before Brenna could form a response, the door opened again. Stellan stood there. The years had been both kind and cruel to him. The lean grace of his youth had hardened into the absolute authority of an alpha king. But there were new lines around his eyes, a fine dusting of silver at his temples. The impenetrable calm he had once projected was gone, replaced by a profound weariness that seemed to settle in his very bones. He looked haunted. His gaze found her, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. He did not look at her as he had in the great hall, with the detached assessment of a king making a difficult choice. He looked at her as a man looks at a ghost. "Brenna," he said. Her name was a rough sound in his throat, as if he hadn't spoken it in years. She gave a slight, formal nod, the muscle in her jaw tight. "Your Majesty." He flinched, a barely perceptible motion. He had expected her anger, her bitterness. He had not expected this cool, distant courtesy. It was a language he did not know how to answer. He looked from her face to the sleeping pup in her arms, and a flicker of something, not hope, but something less fragile, more desperate, entered his eyes. He did not command. He did not demand. He asked, "Will you help us?" It was the last thing she had expected. A plea, not an order. The carefully constructed walls around her heart trembled. She had prepared for a tyrant, for the cold king who had discarded her. She was not prepared for this broken man. He took her silence for refusal. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you." His voice was low, meant for her alone. "But the pups, they are our future, and they are dying." She looked down at Moss, his small side rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She thought of the other pups suffering as he had. Her personal history, the old wounds and remembered slights, seemed small and selfish in the face of it. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his directly. "Show me." Stellan led her not to a room, but down a winding stone staircase into the foundations of the fortress. The air grew thick and heavy with the scent of sickness, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. It was the smell of life giving up. The kennels were a series of stone-floored enclosures, usually bustling with the chaotic energy of young wolves. Now they were unnervingly quiet. In the dim torchlight, she could see small, furry shapes lying on beds of straw, their bodies limp, their breathing shallow. There were a dozen of them, maybe more. A wave of something strange washed over Brenna. It was not pity, not exactly. It was a resonance. In the presence of so much failing wolf spirit, the quiet place inside her, her own lack, felt less like an absence and more like an anchor. The restless energy that made the air feel electric around other shifters was dimming here, fading like dying embers. She could feel it. The other shifters, their own wolves strong and vibrant, would feel this as a discordant, painful wrongness. To her, it was just quiet, a deeper shade of the silence she already carried. One of the pups, a small black one with a white patch on its chest, lifted its head. Its eyes were glazed, but it watched her. It didn't growl, it didn't even whimper. It simply watched as she approached the enclosure. From the shadows in the corner, a small voice piped up. "They don't like anyone to come close, not even the king." Brenna turned. A boy of about 7 or 8 sat huddled against the far wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. He had Stellan's dark hair and a pale, serious face. Finn. She remembered hearing of him, the son of Stellan's sister, orphaned a year ago. The king's ward. "They are afraid," Brenna said softly, her eyes still on the black pup. "They're sad," Finn corrected, his voice solemn. "My pup, Ember, she died last week. She just stopped wanting to play." His lip trembled, but he didn't cry. He looked at the bundle in Brenna's arms. "Is that one sick too?" "He was," Brenna said. "He's feeling better now." She unlatched the gate to the enclosure and stepped inside. Stellan made a move to stop her, a warning on his lips, but Halvor, standing guard at the stairwell, put a hand on his arm. A silent signal. Wait. The sick pups stirred. They watched her, a dozen pairs of clouded eyes. She knelt in the straw, the damp chill seeping through the fabric of her dress. She didn't reach for them. She just sat, letting them grow accustomed to her stillness. The black pup gave a low whine and dragged itself a few inches closer, laying its head near her knee. Another, a pale gray one, shifted its weight, its tail giving a single, weak thump against the stone floor. Finn crept closer, his eyes wide. "They like you." "I don't smell like a threat to them," Brenna murmured, more to herself than to him. She looked at Stellan, who stood frozen, watching the scene with an expression of raw disbelief. "What are the healers saying it is?" "A lung fever," he answered, his voice strained. "But it doesn't respond to any treatment. It's as if their wolves give up. They lose the will to fight, and then the body follows." Brenna closed her eyes, focusing on the feeling in the room. It wasn't just sickness, it was an unraveling, a fraying of the essential bond that made them who they were. The wolf and the person were tied together by a thread of spirit, and something was deliberately, methodically, snipping that thread. This wasn't a disease that had been caught, it was a poison that had been given. Her eyes snapped open, and she looked directly at Stellan, the king who saw her as a solution. But he was seeing the effect, not the cause. He thought she had a gift, a magical touch. The truth was far more practical and far more terrifying. She wasn't a cure. She was just the only one who could feel the crime as it was being committed. "This isn't a fever," she said, her voice low and certain, cutting through the heavy air. "This is an attack." Brenna did not leave the kennels. She made a space for herself in a small, dry storage room nearby, refusing the comfortable chambers Stellan offered. Her place was here, with the dying. She did not have a cure, not a true one, but she had her stillness. Her presence seemed to act as a balm, a strange anchor in the storm of sickness. The pups in her care did not miraculously recover, but the rapid decline she had been told about slowed to a crawl. They drank the water she offered. They allowed her to clean their fur and apply soothing poultices of crushed yarrow and chamomile to their fever-hot bodies. Stellan would appear at odd hours, a ghost in the dim passageways. He never stayed long. He would simply stand in the doorway, watching. One evening, he arrived with a tray. It held a bowl of thick stew, a hunk of fresh bread, and a mug of mulled wine. He set it down on a crate near her without a word. He looked at the pups, who were sleeping more peacefully than they had in weeks, then back at her. His throat worked as if he meant to speak, but no words came. He just gave a single, sharp nod and disappeared back up the stairs. The next night, he brought another tray. The night after that, a pile of clean, warm blankets. These were his words, she realized, these small, silent acts of care. One night, exhaustion finally claimed her. She had been sitting up with the little black pup who had taken a turn for the worse. She must have drifted off, her head leaning against the cold stone wall, the pup a warm weight in her lap. She woke with a start, not because of a sound, but because of a change in the air. A large, dark shape was kneeling in front of her. Stellan. He was in the process of draping his own heavy, fur-lined cloak over her shoulders. His movements were slow, careful, so as not to wake her. His fingers brushed the line of her jaw, a fleeting, unintentional touch that sent a jolt through her entire body. He froze. His eyes, dark pools in the torchlight, met hers. The air crackled with everything left unsaid between them for years. Guilt. Regret. A longing so old it had become a part of his landscape. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He did not apologize. He simply finished settling the cloak around her, his expression shuddered once more. He rose and retreated to the doorway, taking up a silent vigil. He stood there for hours, a sentinel guarding her sleep. Maeva found them like that in the pre-dawn hours, Brenna asleep under the king's cloak and the king standing guard, his face etched with a fierce, weary protectiveness. The old healer's expression softened, the hard lines of her skepticism easing for the first time. She looked at Brenna, truly looked at her, and saw not a wolfless curse, but the woman the king was just now, years too late, beginning to see. The tentative peace was shattered by a sharp, accusatory voice. "There she is, the source of all our ills." Jorund, Stellan's cousin and chief advisor, stood at the top of the stairs, his handsome face twisted with contempt. He was flanked by two of his own guards. He was the one who had been loudest in his support for Stellan's marriage to Lady Albrede, the one who had looked at Brenna with the most disdain. You bring your wolfless taint back to the capital, and suddenly the pack's lifeblood sickens, he sneered, gesturing to the kennels. She is a curse. I said it then, and I say it now. She should have been cast out completely. Brenna stiffened, pulling the cloak tighter around herself. It still held Stellan's scent, pine, cold air, and something uniquely him. Before she could speak, Stellan moved from the doorway, placing himself between her and his cousin. He was not fast, but his movement had a deadly, deliberate grace. He was taller than Jorund, broader. The weariness fell from him like a shed skin, replaced by the cold, absolute authority of the Alpha. "She is here at my request," Stellan said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, dangerous whisper that promised violence far more effectively than any shout. "And she is under my protection." Jorund's eyes widened slightly. He had expected the broken, grieving king. He was not prepared for this. "Touch her," Stellan continued in that same lethal quiet. "Speak to her in that tone again, and you will find out just how long I can hold a grudge." He took another step forward, and Jorund, for all his bluster, took an involuntary step back. The challenge was made, the line drawn in the stone floor of the kennels. For the first time, Stellan had publicly chosen a side, and he had chosen hers. Later, after Jorund had retreated with as much dignity as he could muster, the silence in the kennels felt different. It was no longer just the quiet of sickness, but the charged silence of a question that had been asked and answered. Stellan turned back to Brenna. The king was gone again, leaving the haunted man in his place. "He is wrong," Stellan said, his gaze fixed on some point over her shoulder. "My choice, to set you aside. It was not because you were wolfless." Brenna waited, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. "My father was dying," he said, the words sounding rusted, as if they had been locked away for a long time. Jorund was circling, his ambition a poison in the court. The northern lords were threatening to break away. "My father's last command to me was to secure the throne, to make a match that would bind the pack so tightly Jorund could not shatter it." Albrede's family held the north. Her wolf was a symbol of that strength. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was painful to witness. "I made a promise. I chose the pack. I chose duty. I sacrificed." He stopped. He did not say you. He did not say us. He didn't have to. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering and terrible. Brenna absorbed this, the truth of it settling over the old wound not as a balm, but as a different kind of ache. It had not been about her lack, it had been about his, a lack of choice, a lack of courage. "I am sorry, Brenna," he whispered. 3 words that cost him more than a kingdom. The tension was broken by Finn, who had slipped down the stairs, drawn by the confrontation. He ignored the charged atmosphere completely, his focus entirely on Brenna. He sat beside her, leaning his small, warm body against her side. "Why don't you have a wolf?" he asked, his voice clear and curious. It was the question no one had dared ask her for years. Brenna looked down at the boy, at his trusting, open face. "I was just born this way," she said simply. "Some people have blue eyes, some have brown. I was born without a wolf song inside me." Finn considered this with the solemn gravity of a child. He leaned in closer and sniffed her shoulder, a gesture so purely wolfish it made her smile. He pulled back, his brow furrowed in thought. "But you smell like home," he declared, "like the dens are supposed to smell after a long winter. Safe." The words struck Brenna with the force of a physical blow. Safe. Home. The dens. She looked around the sick-filled kennels at the weak, dying pups. The sickness was an unraveling. But what if her wolflessness wasn't just a quiet place? What if it was an anchor because it was tied to the source of their strength? The earth, the den itself. An idea, wild and improbable, took root. The sickness wasn't in the air, it was in the foundation. "The water," she whispered, her eyes wide. She scrambled to her feet and went to the stone basin where the water for the pups was drawn. It came from a cistern fed by an underground stream that ran beneath the fortress. She dipped her fingers in, bringing them to her nose. Nothing. Just the clean, metallic scent of cold water. But Finn's words echoed in her head. "You smell like home." She did not. The den smelled like her, like earth and moss and the deep, quiet things that grew without a wolf's fire. The poison wasn't something that smelled foul, it was the opposite. It was something that smelled like nothing, something that slowly, imperceptibly erased the scent of home, the scent of the pack's magic, from the very water they drank. It was an herb she knew from the cliffs of her exile. Ghost thistle, a rare parasitic plant that grew only in deep shade and, when ingested by shifters, caused a slow, creeping lethargy, a disassociation from their inner wolf. It was an assassin's tool, subtle, slow, and utterly devastating. And someone was feeding it into the heart of Stonefall. She had to find the source. The underground stream that fed the cistern was her only lead. When Brenna told Stellan her theory, he didn't question it. The weariness in his face was replaced by a grim, focused intensity. He saw the logic in it instantly, the cold, calculating cruelty that pointed directly to a mind like Joran's. "The stream surfaces in the Wolfwood, north of the fortress," he said, his mind already mapping the terrain. "I will take a handful of guards." "No," Brenna said firmly. "If Jorand is behind this, he will have lookouts. A troop of guards will be seen from a mile away. It must be just the two of us. You know the woods, and I know what we are looking for." He argued, his protective instincts warring with the sense in her words. But he saw the truth in her logic. A king and a wolfless woman would draw far less suspicion than a war party. It was a risk, but the alternative was to sit here and watch their future die. They left before dawn, dressed in the simple leathers of hunters, slipping out of a postern gate while the fortress still slept. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For the first hour they moved in silence, Stellan setting a relentless pace, Brenna matching it without complaint. Her years of walking the cliffs and foraging in the harsh coastal landscape had given her an endurance that surprised him. As the sun rose, casting long, golden fingers of light through the canopy, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by the shared rhythm of their journey. They were no longer a king and his outcast subject, they were just two people, moving through the woods with a single purpose. They stopped to rest by a clear, fast-running brook. Stellan built a small, smokeless fire with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. He produced hard cheese and dried meat from a pack, handing her a share. "Tell me about your life," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of command. "On the coast." She had expected the question to be painful, but it wasn't. She told him about her cottage, about learning the names of the seabirds, about the way the light changed on the water through the seasons. She spoke of the solitude not as a punishment, but as something that had hollowed her out and then filled her with a different kind of strength. She did not speak of loneliness. She did not have to. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He just listened, his gaze fixed on her face, and for the first time, she felt truly seen by him, not as a symbol of what was lost or a tool to be used, but as Brenna, the woman who had survived him. "You were not meant for a cage," he said softly, looking around at the vast, wild forest, even a gilded one. It was an apology. It was a confession. It was the closest he could come to saying he had been wrong. A strange, fragile intimacy began to weave itself around them in the quiet of the woods. Later, as they followed the stream deeper into the forest, they had to cross a place where the water ran swift and deep over slick stones. He went first, then turned, holding out his hand to her. She hesitated for a heartbeat. His hand remained outstretched, steady, waiting. It was not a demand, it was an offer. She placed her hand in his. His fingers were strong and warm, closing around hers. The contact was electric, a current of warmth that ran straight to the hollow place in her chest. He guided her across, his grip sure and steady, and even after she was safely on the other side, he did not immediately let go. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a small, unconscious caress. They found it an hour later. Tucked into a rocky ravine, hidden by a thicket of overgrown briars, was a small, crude encampment. A thin plume of smoke rose from a concealed fire pit, and beside it, two men were crushing herbs into a fine powder and wrapping it in oilcloth packets. The bitter, cloying scent of ghost thistle hung faintly in the air. The men wore the livery of Joran's personal household guard, and they were camped just upstream from where the water disappeared into the earth, feeding the cisterns of Stonefall. Brenna looked at Stellan. His face was a mask of cold fury. The proof was right in front of them. They were outnumbered. A direct confrontation would be suicide. Stellan's hand went to the hilt of his sword, his wolf spirit rising, urging him to violence, to the swift, brutal justice of the Alpha. But Brenna placed a hand on his arm, a silent plea for patience. "We need the proof," she whispered. "Not just their bodies. We need to bring the poison back to the elders." He looked at her, at the clear, practical intelligence in her eyes, and the red haze of his anger receded. She was right. Joran had to be exposed, not just eliminated. He had woven his lies too deep into the fabric of the court. To kill his men here would look like a paranoid king's overreach. They needed to be smarter. Brenna's mind, honed by years of quiet observation and making do, saw a way. "The ravine," she said, pointing up the steep, rocky slope above the camp. "The rocks are loose there, a landslide, not to kill them, but to separate them, to create a diversion." It was a daring plan, but Stellan saw the genius in it. He gave her a sharp nod. "I will create the slide. You use the chaos to get one of those packets." "I'll need a distraction of my own," she said, her eyes scanning the area. She pointed to a dense patch of dry brush and fallen leaves downwind from the camp. "Fire." They separated, moving like ghosts through the undergrowth. Brenna gathered a bundle of the driest tinder she could find. From a pouch at her belt, she took out a flint and steel. Waiting, she watched Stellan climb the ravine with the silent, sure-footed grace of a predator. He reached the loose scree field, positioning himself above the camp. He looked down, met her gaze across the distance, and gave a barely perceptible nod. Brenna struck the flint. The spark caught, and a tiny flame licked at the tinder. She fed it, nurtured it, then thrust the burning bundle into the heart of the dry brush. The fire caught with a hungry whoosh, and thick, acrid smoke began to billow toward the camp. At the same moment, Stellan heaved his weight against a massive, precariously balanced boulder. With a groan of protesting earth, it gave way, tumbling down the slope and triggering a cascade of rock and dirt. The men in the camp shouted in alarm, one pointing at the fire, the other at the landslide that was now thundering down, cutting off their escape route up the ravine. In the panic, they abandoned their work. one running to stamp out the spreading flames, the other scrambling to save their packs. It was the opening Brenna needed. She darted from her hiding place, a gray shadow against the trees, snatched one of the oilcloth packets from the ground, and melted back into the woods. The plan had worked perfectly. Too perfectly. As she rejoined Stellan at their designated meeting point, a figure stepped out from behind a massive oak. It was one of Yoren's men, one she hadn't seen, clearly posted as a sentry. He held a drawn sword, his eyes wide with surprise that quickly hardened into malice. Before he could shout a warning, Stellan was on him, a blur of dark leather and flashing steel. The fight was brutal and short, but as the sentry fell, two more men crashed through the undergrowth, drawn by the sound of the struggle. Brenna's heart leaped into her throat. They were trapped. As the first man lunged at Stellan, a new figure entered the fray. Halvor. The guard captain burst from the trees, his own greatsword singing through the air, and engaged the second attacker. He had followed them. The loyal, silent captain had never intended to let his king walk into danger alone. The fight was a chaotic whirl of motion. Brenna pressed herself against a tree, clutching the precious packet of poison, feeling utterly useless. She saw Stellan dispatch his opponent, but as he turned, the man Halvor was fighting broke free and made a desperate lunge, not for the king, but for her. Stellan moved without thinking. He threw himself in front of her, his body a shield. The sword, meant for her, sank deep into his side. A pained grunt was torn from his lips, but his eyes were fixed on her, ensuring she was unharmed. Halvor finished the last man with a grim finality. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the distant fire and Stellan's harsh breathing. He staggered, pressing a hand to his side, where blood was already soaking through the leather. "Stellan!" Brenna cried, rushing to his side, helping him to the ground. The wound was deep, high on his ribs, not immediately fatal, but dangerous. His head fell back against the mossy earth, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His eyes found hers, hazy with pain. A fever was already beginning to cloud his senses. And in that delirium, with his defenses shattered, he spoke the one word he had held back for so long, a name that was both a prayer and a confession. Brenna. The journey back was a nightmare. Halvor half-carried, half-dragged the feverish king, while Brenna tried to staunch the bleeding with strips of cloth torn from her own clothes. Stellan drifted in and out of consciousness, his delirious murmurs a jumble of pack business, old battles, and her name, repeated over and over like a mantra. Each time he said it, it was a fresh wound in her own heart. They brought him in through the same secret gate, avoiding the main fortress. Maeva was waiting, her face a grim mask. She took one look at the king's ashen face and the blood-soaked bandage and began barking orders. They got him to his chambers, stripped off his bloody tunic, and Maeva went to work, her old hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned the wound and began stitching. Brenna stood back, feeling helpless. She had the proof, the packet of ghost thistle clutched in her hand, but the man who had risked his life for her was now fighting for his own. His fever was climbing. Maeva worked, her lips a thin, grim line. "It's deep," the old healer muttered, more to herself than anyone, "and festering already. The blade was likely dirty." She glanced at Brenna. "He will need his strength. His wolf will help him fight. But he is weak from weeks of worry." Stellan tossed his head on the pillows, his eyes clenched shut. "Brenna, forgive me," he mumbled, the words slurred with pain. Maeva's hand stilled for a second. She looked at Brenna, then back at her king. The confession, unintended and raw, hung in the air. The truth of his long-held grief was laid bare for anyone to see. The king's armor was gone, and the man beneath was bleeding out his regrets. When Maeva had done all she could, she turned to Brenna. "Now is not the time for grief. It is the time for justice. The pack is without a conscious alpha. Jorund will use this moment. You have the proof. You must use it. Brenna's gaze went from Stellan's pale face to the packet in her hand. Maeva was right. This was not over. It had just begun. Leaving Halvor to stand guard over the king, she walked out of the chamber, her spine straight, her purpose clear. She went to the Hall of Elders. The Council of Elders, 5 of the oldest and most respected members of the pack, assembled in the stone chamber. Their faces were grave. Word of the king's hunting accident had spread, and the atmosphere in the fortress was thick with tension. Jorund was already there, presiding in the Alpha's absence, his face a perfect mask of concern. An unfortunate accident, he was saying as Brenna entered. The king was reckless, venturing out with only— His voice trailed off as he saw her. He had not expected her to return. His eyes narrowed. It was no accident, Brenna said, her voice ringing with clarity in the silent hall. She walked to the center of the room and placed the oilcloth packet on the great stone table. The king was wounded protecting me from assassins, your assassins, Jorund. A collective gasp went through the room. Jorund laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The wolfless Omega makes accusations. She who has brought this sickness upon us? This is her hysteria, her attempt to deflect from her own guilt. He turned to the elders. She has no standing here. Her word is meaningless. Her word is not the only one, a new voice said. Maeva stepped forward from the shadows by the door. I have analyzed the water from the kennels. It carries a trace of this. She gestured to the packet. Ghost thistle, a poison that attacks the wolf. A poison I have seen you researching in the old texts, Jorund. Jorund's face paled slightly. Coincidence. I am a scholar. I also speak for her, Halvor said, appearing at Maeva's side. His armor was still stained with the dirt of the forest. I saw Jorund's men attack the king. I fought them myself. Jorund's composure began to crack. Lies, all of them. A conspiracy forged by a bitter exile, a senile healer, and a disloyal guard. Just then, the great doors to the hall swung open again. Little Finn stood there, his face streaked with tears. He had clearly run from his chambers. He pointed a trembling finger at Jorund. I saw you, he cried, his child's voice high and piercing. I saw you by the cisterns last week. You had a bag. You told me you were making the water sweet for the pups. But it smelled, Dad. It smelled empty. The final piece clicked into place. The child's truth, pure and unvarnished. The elders looked at Jorund, their faces like stone. The web of his deceit was unraveling. Cornered, his ambition turning to feral panic, Jorund snarled. You will all pay for this, he roared, his body beginning to contort, his bones shifting as he tried to call his wolf. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to seize power through brute force. But nothing happened. A spasm of pain crossed his face. His shift faltered, collapsing in on itself. His own wolf, weakened by long-term, low-level exposure to the very poison he had been handling, refused his call. He stumbled, clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was a shifter who could not shift, a warrior without his primary weapon, powerless. The hall was silent. The reversal was absolute. The man who had used Brenna's wolflessness as a weapon was now undone by the weakness of his own wolf. Halvor's men moved in, taking the gasping, defeated Jorund into custody without a struggle. In the aftermath, Brenna stood alone in the center of the hall. The elders were murmuring, Maeva was tending to Finn, and the world had shifted on its axis. Across the room, leaning heavily on the doorframe, stood Stellan. He had dragged himself from his bed, his face ashen, a fresh bloom of red staining the bandage at his side. He must have heard the commotion. He had come to stand with her. He wasn't looking at the captive Jorund or the elders. He was looking only at her. And in his eyes, across the vast stone hall, was a question. A silent, desperate plea he could not, speak aloud. The antidote was not some complex potion. It was rooted in the very things Brenna had been using all along. With Jorun's poison removed from the water source, the poultices and teas she made from yarrow, willow bark, and other common herbs were enough to help the pups' bodies fight off the lingering effects. Her gift was not magic, it was knowledge. An intimate, practical understanding of the land, of balance, the very thing Jorund had sought to destroy. The quiet of her blood had allowed her to hear the earth when everyone else was deafened by the song of their own wolf. Within a week, the kennels were filled with the clumsy, joyful sounds of recovering pups. Moss, her first patient, was the strongest of them all, a tiny silver shadow that followed her everywhere. The pack, from the lowest Omega to the highest-ranking Elder, now looked at her with a new kind of reverence. She was not just the wolfless girl, she was the heart-tender, the one who had saved their future. Stellan recovered slowly. As his strength returned, so did a measure of his reserve, but the impenetrable wall was gone. The raw vulnerability she had seen in him remained just beneath the surface. One of his first acts upon reclaiming his authority was to formally and publicly dissolve the betrothal contract with his dead mate's family. It was a political risk, severing the alliance with the North, but it was a necessary one. He was freeing himself from the ghosts of his past, from the promise that had cost him everything. He did not summon her to the throne room. He came to her where she was most herself, in the quiet, straw-scented warmth of the kennels. She was sitting on the floor, allowing Moss and the little black pup to tumble over her lap. She looked up as he entered, his footsteps soft on the stone. He wore simple clothes, no crown, no emblems of his office. He was just Stellan. He stopped a few feet away from her. He looked tired, but the haunted expression was gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. He had faced down assassins and traitors, but he seemed more afraid now than she had ever seen him.
"The Northern Lords are angry," he said, his voice low. "They say I have dishonored Albred's memory."
Brenna stroked Moss's soft fur. "You honored the promise you made your father. Now you are honoring yourself." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I don't know how to do that." He took a breath. "Jorun's trial is set. The elders have named you a friend of the pack, granted you lands, a title." He trailed off. These were offerings, reparations. They were not what he had come to say. He looked at her, sitting on the floor, covered in pups, more regal in her simple dress than any queen in silk. "Stay," he said. Just that one word. It was not a command, it was a plea, stripped of all artifice. It held everything inside it. "Stay here with me. Stay and let me try to undo the damage I have done. Stay and let me learn how to be the man you deserve." He did not move toward her. He did not breach the space between them. He offered, and he waited. It was the gesture she now understood was the truest part of him. The deference, the respect for her choice, was his heart's native language. She had loved a king once, a fantasy forged in a young girl's heart. That love had died, starved of warmth and air. This feeling now was something else entirely. It was quieter, deeper. It was a woman looking at a man, flawed, wounded, and trying to be better, and seeing a place to build a new kind of home. Slowly, she rose to her feet. The pups scattered, whining in protest. She closed the distance between them, one step at a time. She stopped directly in front of him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She lifted her hand, not to his face, not in a caress, but placed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, heavy beat beneath her palm, a rhythm that finally felt in harmony with the quiet in her own blood. "I'm already home," she said. 2 years later, snow fell in thick, silent flakes outside the tall, arched windows of the king's private chambers, blanketing the dark stone of Stonefall in a mantle of white. Inside, a great fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. The air smelled of wood smoke, beeswax, and contentment. Stellan was on the floor, sprawled on a bearskin rug, enduring a gleeful assault from a young, silver-furred wolf who was determined to chew on his boot. Moss was no longer a pup, but a boisterous adolescent, his loyalty to Brenna matched only by his deep affection for the king. Stellan grunted as the wolf pounced on his chest, but his hands were gentle, scratching behind Moss's ears. By the fire, Finn, now a lanky boy of 10, was engrossed in a heavy, leather-bound book, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the room was comfortable, lived in, woven from threads of shared peace. Brenna entered from the adjoining room carrying a wooden tray. It held 2 earthenware mugs of steaming chamomile tea and a small plate of honey cakes. She wore a simple wool dress the color of moss, her hair in a loose braid down her back. She held no official title. The pack did not call her queen. They called her Brenna, or sometimes, in hushed, reverent tones, the heart tender. She was the anchor, the quiet center around which their wild, fierce world turned. She set the tray on a low table and sat in a large, worn armchair near the fire. Stellan looked up, and the simple act of her entering the room seemed to settle something in him. He shifted, leaving Moss to his own devices, and came to rest his head against her knee, his back against the chair. He closed his eyes, a long, weary sigh escaping him. It wasn't the sigh of a haunted man, but of a man who had worked hard and come home to his den. Brenna threaded her fingers through his hair. It was thicker now, the silver at his temples more pronounced. She said nothing. There were no grand declarations of love between them, no flowery pronouncements. Their love was in the shared silence, the pot of tea, the way he sought her out for this simple, grounding touch. It was in the way Halvor now smiled, a rare, cracking thing whenever he saw her. It was in the way Maeva taught her the deeper secrets of the healing arts. It was in the way Finn treated her as the most natural and essential part of his world. It was the earned quiet, the safety of the found family they had built from the wreckage of their past. Stellan opened his eyes. He didn't move, just tilted his head back to look up at her. His gaze, once like polished stone, was clear and deep. It held the memory of their journey, the pain and the healing, the regret and the redemption. It held a love so profound and absolute it needed no words. He had waited for her, he had earned her, and here, in the warmth of the fire, surrounded by their unconventional pack, they had found their fated refuge not in a prophecy, but in a choice. A choice to stay, a choice to heal, a choice to be home.